Drea, one of the biggest misunderstandings people have about avoidance is the belief that they suddenly wake up one morning and simply stop loving someone. That is rarely what actually happens. In most cases, the emotional disconnection starts quietly and visibly long before the relationship officially changes. The tragedy is that the partner usually doesn't notice it at first because the avoidant often continues going through the motions. They still text, they still show up, they still say the right things occasionally. But internally, something has already started shutting down. And this is where the confusion becomes devastating. Because when someone slowly disconnects emotionally instead of communicating honestly, the other person feels the shift but cannot explain it. They start questioning themselves. Did I do something wrong? Why do they suddenly feel distant? Why does it feel colder even though nothing happened? What they are sensing is not always the absence of love. Many times it is the presence of fear. See, avoidants are not emotionless people. That is one of the greatest myths in modern relationships. Avoidants often feel deeply, sometimes deeper than people realize. 3 is Z. The difference is that they learned very early in life that emotional dependence feels unsafe. Somewhere in their psychological development, vulnerability became associated with pain, disappointment, rejection, criticism, or loss of freedom. So when relationships begin moving from attraction into true intimacy, their nervous system interprets closeness as danger. This is why the beginning of relationships can feel so powerful with avoidance. In the early stages, intimacy is still controlled. There is excitement, novelty, mystery, distance. They can experience connection without fully surrendering emotionally. But the moment the relationship becomes real, the moment there are expectations, deeper emotional needs, consistency, commitment, or genuine dependence, the unconscious fear begins activating underneath the surface. And most avoidants do not consciously recognize this process while it's happening. That's important to understand. They do not sit there saying, I am afraid of intimacy. Instead, the fear disguises itself as other thoughts. Suddenly they feel uncertain. Suddenly they become hyper-aware of flaws in their partner. Suddenly they feel emotionally trapped, irritated, overwhelmed, or numb. They start convincing themselves the relationship is losing its spark. But psychologically, what is often disappearing is not love, it is emotional safety inside themselves. Human beings have a remarkable ability to rationalize their emotional defenses. The mind always creates a story to justify what the nervous system is avoiding. So instead of saying, I'm scared to need you, the avoidance says, maybe you're not the right person. Instead of saying, this intimacy is overwhelming me, they say, I think I lost feelings. Instead of saying, I don't know how to stay emotionally open, they slowly retreat into distance and silence. And the painful part is that many avoidants genuinely believe their own explanation in the moment, because emotional suppression disconnects people not only from others, but from themselves. Over time, they become so practiced at avoiding vulnerability that they lose access to the deeper truth underneath their reactions. This creates one of the cruelest dynamics in modern relationships. One person fights harder for connection while the other quietly disconnects internally without fully understanding why. And when communication disappears, imagination takes over. The partner starts over-analyzing everything. They chase clarity. They try harder. They give more love, more reassurance, more patience. But the more pressure the avoidant feels emotionally, the more their instinct is often to retreat further inward. Not because love never existed, but because intimacy activated unresolved fear they never learned to process. That is the brutal reality people struggle to accept. Avoidants do not always fall out of love in the way people think. Sometimes they fall into self-protection so deeply that love can no longer reach them clearly. And when fear becomes stronger than vulnerability, emotional distance begins long before physical separation ever happens. That is how people slowly lose each other without ever truly understanding when it began. What makes this dynamic even more confusing is that avoidants often seem the most loving in the beginning. In fact, many people describe the early stages with an avoidant as intense, magnetic, even intoxicating. There is chemistry, emotional excitement, deep conversation, passion, and sometimes what feels like genuine emotional availability. And this creates a painful contradiction later because the partner thinks, if they were capable of loving me like that before, what changed? What changed is not always the existence of love. What changed is the level of emotional risk. In the beginning of a relationship, connection feels exciting because it still exists inside emotional freedom. There is possibility without full responsibility, desire without total vulnerability. The avoidant can move toward intimacy while still feeling psychologically in control. And control matters deeply to avoidant attachment styles because control creates safety. But real love eventually asks for something deeper. It asks for consistency when emotions fluctuate. It asks for emotional exposure. It asks for interdependence. It asks two people to slowly remove the masks they used to survive life emotionally. And for someone with unresolved attachment wounds, that process can feel terrifying at a subconscious level. This is why avoidants often experience an internal conflict they cannot fully explain. One part of them genuinely wants love, closeness, connection, partnership, but another part associates closeness with pain, engulfment, rejection, disappointment, reappointment, or the loss of autonomy. So as intimacy deepens, both desires begin fighting each other internally, and eventually fear starts overpowering connection. The deeper the relationship becomes, the more emotionally exposed the avoidant feels. Suddenly, they are no longer just dating someone, they are emotionally depending on someone. And dependence is where the nervous system panic often begins. Because if you need someone, they can hurt you. If you fully open your heart, they can abandon you. If you trust completely, you lose control over the outcome. Most avoidants developed emotional self-protection long before adulthood. Some learned that vulnerability led to criticism. Others learned that emotional needs were ignored, dismissed, or unsafe to express. So they adapted by becoming emotionally self-contained. Independence became survival. Distance became regulation. Emotional control became protection. Now here's the paradox. Those same defenses that protected them emotionally in childhood begin sabotaging intimacy in adulthood. Because healthy love requires the exact thing avoidants were trained to fear: sustained emotional openness. This is why many avoidants consciously pull away right when the relationship becomes most meaningful. Not because the connection means nothing, but because it suddenly means too much. People often assume fear appears when love is absent. But psychologically, fear usually appears when love becomes significant. Think about that. Nobody fears losing what they never cared about. The intensity of avoidance often reflects the intensity of emotional activation underneath the surface. That is why avoidance may become distant after moments of deep connection, after vulnerability, after commitment conversations, after emotional closeness. Their nervous system interprets intimacy as exposure, and exposure triggers self-protection. And then something subtle happens psychologically. The avoidant begins searching for reasons to create emotional distance. The mind starts magnifying imperfections. Small issues suddenly feel enormous. Certainty disappears. Emotional numbness appears. They begin confusing anxiety with incompatibility. This is where many relationships collapse under misunderstanding. The partner thinks if they loved me, they wouldn't pull away, but for avoidance, pulling away is often precisely what happens when feelings become overwhelming. Now, that does not justify hurtful behavior. It does not excuse emotional inconsistency or lack of communication. But understanding the mechanism matters because it changes how we interpret the behavior. What looks like indifference is often emotional dysregulation hidden beneath detachment. And the tragedy is that avoidants themselves frequently misread their own experience. They think the relationship is suffocating them when in reality they are confronting unresolved fears they carried long before the relationship began. So they run from the connection believing they are escaping the problem. But wherever they go, the same fear eventually follows. Because the issue was never simply the relationship itself. The issue was the meaning intimacy carried inside their nervous system. And until someone learns that love is not the enemy, they will keep abandoning connections that require emotional courage. That is the brutal paradox of avoidance. The closer love gets to the heart, the louder fear begins to speak. One of the most overlooked realities about avoidant attachment is that many avoidants do not actually know what healthy love feels like emotionally. What they often recognize instead is intensity. And those two things are not always the same. This is where relationships become deeply misunderstood. Many avoidants unconsciously associate emotional excitement with love because excitement feels familiar to their nervous system. The chase, uncertainty, emotional highs and lows, unpredictability, distance, all of these create stimulation. And stimulation can easily be confused with passion. But calmness, consistency, emotional safety, and stability? To someone with unresolved attachment wounds, those things can initially feel emotionally flat. Not because healthy love is boring, but because their nervous system was conditioned around emotional tension rather than emotional peace. Human beings become emotionally attached to what feels familiar, even when what feels familiar is unhealthy. If someone grows up around inconsistency, emotional unavailability, mixed signals, or conditional affection, then they may be more likely to experience relationship problems. Then emotional instability becomes psychologically normalized. Their body learns to associate longing with love, anxiety with attraction, and emotional unpredictability with emotional depth. So when they finally encounter a relationship that is secure and emotionally stable, something strange happens internally. Instead of feeling intense excitement, they feel calm. And because calmness feels unfamiliar, the mind misinterprets it. This relationship has no spark. Maybe I lost feelings. Something feels missing. But what is actually missing is emotional chaos. That distinction changes everything. See, healthy relationships naturally become more stable over time. The early dopamine-driven intensity of attraction eventually evolves into trust, emotional safety, companionship, consistency, and deeper attachment. That is not the death of love. That is the maturation of love. But avoidants often experience this transition differently because they're nervous. System unconsciously expects emotional distance or stimulation to maintain attraction. When the relationship becomes peaceful, their brain starts searching for the emotional intensity at once associated with desire. And this is where self-sabotage quietly begins. Sometimes avoidants create emotional distance without realizing it, simply to reactivate emotional tension. They become colder, less available, more uncertain. They focus on flaws. They fantasize about escape or idealize other possibilities. Not always because they truly want someone else, but because emotional uncertainty temporarily recreates the stimulation their nervous system is addicted to. This is why some avoidants feel more emotionally activated after a breakup than during a healthy relationship itself. Once distance exists again, longing returns. Obsession returns. Emotional intensity returns. Suddenly they miss the relationship deeply. Why? Because separation reactivates anxiety, and anxiety feels emotionally familiar. That is one of the cruelest psychological traps in modern relationships. People sometimes mistake emotional instability for emotional depth. And our culture reinforces this confusion constantly. Movies glorify toxic passion. Social media romanticizes emotional unavailability. People equate butterflies with destiny and calmness with settling. But biologically, butterflies are often just nervous system activation. They are not always evidence of compatibility. Real love is often quieter than fantasy. Real love is waking up and choosing consistency. Real love is emotional safety without losing attraction. Real love is vulnerability without manipulation. But for someone conditioned to equate love with emotional turbulence, healthy intimacy can initially feel emotionally unfamiliar, even uncomfortable. And the mind always tries to return to what feels familiar. This is why avoidants sometimes leave healthy relationships searching for a feeling they cannot even fully define. They believe they are searching for stronger chemistry, stronger passion, stronger certainty. But many times they are actually searching for emotional activation disguised as love. The problem is that nervous system addiction and emotional fulfillment are not the same thing. One creates intensity, the other creates peace. And emotionally immature attachment styles often struggle to tolerate peace because peace requires stillness. It requires presence. It requires emotional openness without the distraction of drama or pursuit. That kind of intimacy forces a person to confront themselves directly. No games, no emotional running, no chasing emotional highs. Just connection. And for avoidance, sustained connection can feel more psychologically exposing than conflict itself. So when they say, I think the spark is the Rhea gone, what they may really mean is my nervous system no longer feels stimulated by instability. That is not the same as falling out of love. It is the inability to recognize secure love as emotionally fulfilling. And until someone learns the difference between peace and boredom, they may spend their entire life abandoning healthy relationships in search of emotional chaos they mistake for passion. Because sometimes the greatest tragedy is not losing love. It is failing to recognize it once it finally becomes safe. One of the most painful parts of loving an avoidant is not always the distance itself, it is the silence surrounding the distance. Because when emotionally healthy people struggle in relationships, they usually try to communicate the struggle. They explain what they are feeling. They ask questions. They seek clarity. But avoidants often do the opposite. Instead of moving toward conversation, they move toward withdrawal. And that withdrawal creates enormous psychological confusion for the person on the receiving end. Because human beings can handle pain more easily than uncertainty. What destroys people emotionally is not always rejection, it is ambiguity. Is feeling someone slowly disappear emotionally while pretending everything is fine. It is sensing a wall forming where connection used to exist, but never receiving a clear explanation for why. And most avoidants are not doing this because they are intentionally cruel. Many genuinely do not know how to process emotional overwhelm in real time. That is important to understand. Emotional avoidance is not just avoiding other people. It is avoiding internal emotional discomfort itself. When difficult emotions arise, fear, vulnerability, guilt, shame, dependency, disappointment avoidants often suppress the feeling before they consciously understand it. Instead of sitting with emotional tension and communicating through it, they instinctively disconnect from the source of the discomfort. And unfortunately, that source becomes the relationship. So rather than saying, I'm emotionally overwhelmed right now, they become distant. Rather than saying, I'm afraid of how much this relationship means to me, they become cold or critical. Rather than saying, I'm struggling internally, they suddenly need space without explanation. And the partner gets trapped trying to solve a puzzle they were never given the pieces to. This is why relationships with avoidance often produce obsessive overthinking in the other person. The lack of emotional clarity forces the partner into constant interpretation. They analyze text messages, tone changes, delayed responses, facial expressions, small behavioral shifts. Because when communication disappears, the mind starts searching desperately for certainty. And the deeper problem is that avoidants frequently intellectualize emotions instead of truly processing them. They stay in their heads rather than their emotional experience. They rationalize distance. They explain away vulnerability. They convince themselves the relationship is the issue rather than confronting the fear activated within them. This creates a dangerous cycle. The more disconnected the avoidant becomes, the more anxious the partner often becomes. The more anxious the partner becomes, the more emotional pressure the avoidant feels. And the more pressure they feel, the further they withdraw emotionally. Soon, both people are reacting to each other's survival patterns rather than actually relating authentically. One chases connection, the other escapes PR, Escher, and neither feels emotionally safe. What makes this especially tragic is that many avoidants deeply care about the person they are hurting. But caring and communicating are not the same thing. Love without emotional transparency creates confusion instead of security. A relationship cannot survive on unspoken feelings. Because silence forces people to create stories, and the stories people create in emotional uncertainty are often brutal. I'm not enough, they never loved me. I'm too much, something is wrong with me. Meanwhile, the avoidant may be internally struggling with emotions they cannot even articulate properly themselves. This is why emotional maturity is not measured by how strongly someone feels love. It is measured by their ability to remain emotionally present when love becomes uncomfortable. Anyone can feel connection during easy moments, but intimacy eventually demands confrontation with fears, insecurities, needs, wounds, expectations, and vulnerability. And if someone lacks the emotional tools to navigate that confrontation honestly, they escape internally instead. That escape may look like emotional numbness, detachment. It may look like criticism, distraction, avoidance, or sudden uncertainty. But underneath many of those behaviors is a person who never learned how to stay emotionally available during emotional discomfort. And here is the brutal reality. Unresolved avoidance turns communication into a threat rather than a bridge. Because communication requires vulnerability. It requires admitting confusion. It requires tolerating emotional exposure without shutting down. And many avoidants would rather silently detach than risk feeling emotionally seen too deeply. But relationships cannot heal inside emotional silence. People do not feel love simply because feelings exist internally. They feel love through emotional presence, honesty, consistency, and communication. And when someone cannot communicate their inner world, they slowly become emotionally unreachable even while physically standing beside you. That is how people lose each other long before the relationship officially ends. One of the most misunderstood phases in avoidant behavior happens after the relationship ends or emotional distance is finally created. Most people assume that if an avoidant leaves and apologizes, appears calm, detached, or even relieved afterward, it must mean they never truly cared. But psychologically, that interpretation is often incomplete. Because for many avoidants, the first emotion they experience after separation is not heartbreak, it is relief. And that relief can feel shocking to the partner who is desperately fighting to save the connection. But you have to understand what is happening internally. During deep intimacy, avoidants often carry enormous unconscious emotional tension. Commitment, vulnerability, emotional expectations, conflict, dependency, all of these activate their nervous system over time. Even when the relationship is loving, their internal world can feel emotionally crowded. So when distance finally happens, the immediate pressure disappears. No more difficult conversations. No more emotional exposure. No more feeling responsible for someone else's emotional needs. No more confronting vulnerability every day. The nervous system finally relaxes. And in that moment, relief feels like certainty. This is why avoidants sometimes leave relationships believing they made the right decision immediately afterward. The absence of emotional press, creates temporary clarity. They confuse the calming of anxiety with proof they no longer love the person. But relief is not always the same thing as emotional resolution. In fact, relief can simply mean the nervous system escaped discomfort temporarily. And this is where time changes everything. Because once the emotional noise fades, once the pressure dissolves, once the avoidant no longer feels emotionally cornered, another experience often begins emerging slowly underneath the silence. Unresolved attachment. At first, they distract themselves. Work, routines, freedom, casual connections, independence. Anything that restores emotional distance. But human emotions do not disappear simply because they are avoided. Suppressed feelings often return later, sometimes with even greater intensity. And this is why avoidants frequently process grief in reverse. Securely attached people often feel heartbreak immediately. They confront the loss directly. They cry, reflect, grieve, and slowly heal. Avoidants often experience the opposite timeline. First comes emotional suppression and relief. Then, weeks or months later, the emotional reality starts catching up. Memories begin regarding. Is surfacing unexpectedly. Loneliness becomes louder. The emotional safety they once took for granted becomes more visible in hindsight. And suddenly, the person they emotionally minimized during the relationship becomes psychologically significant after the distance is permanent. This is why many avoidants reconnect long after relationships end. Sometimes subtly, sometimes intensely, sometimes through messages that seem emotionally confusing or inconsistent. It is not always manipulation in the calculated sense people assume. Often it is delayed emotional processing finally surfacing once the threat of intimacy no longer feels immediate. Distance feels safer than closeness. So paradoxically, some avoidants can access their feelings more clearly after losing someone than while actually being with them. That is the tragedy. Because by the time emotional clarity arrives, the relationship may already be broken beyond repair. Now, this does not mean every avoidant secretly regrets leaving, nor does it mean every avoidant returns. But psychologically, unresolved attachment rarely disappears cleanly. Human beings cannot repeatedly suppress vulnerability without consequences. Onal avoidance delays emotional processing, it does not eliminate it. And many avoidants eventually discover something painful. The freedom they thought they wanted does not automatically create fulfillment. Because independence without emotional connection eventually becomes isolation. And emotional numbness mistaken for strength eventually becomes loneliness. This is where the deeper philosophical truth emerges. Human beings are wired for attachment. We are wired for emotional connection, belonging, intimacy, and shared emotional experience. You can suppress those needs intellectually, distract yourself behaviorally, or deny them emotionally. But eventually, the deeper human need for connection resurfaces. The problem is that avoidants often realize the value of emotional safety only after it is gone, not because they are evil, not because they never loved, but because fear prevented them from fully experiencing the relationship while they were inside it. And by the time the nervous system quiets down enough to feel clearly, they are left confronting absence instead of intimacy. That is why unresolved avoidance creates such painful cycles. People run from emotional discharge, for it only to encounter emotional emptiness later. Because escaping vulnerability may create temporary relief, but it can also cost someone the very connection they spend the rest of their life quietly missing. And this brings us to the hardest truth in this entire conversation, the truth most people resist because it is emotionally painful to accept. Love alone cannot heal avoidant patterns. That idea challenges one of the most seductive myths people carry into relationships, the belief that if they love someone deeply enough, patiently enough, purely enough, they can help that person overcome their emotional defenses. People tell themselves, if I just prove I'm safe, if I just love harder, if I just stay longer, eventually they'll open up. That is a beautiful idea. And it is often a destructive one, because while love can create the conditions for healing, it cannot force healing. No partner, no matter how emotionally intelligent, compassionate, patient, or devoted, can do someone else's inner work for them. That work is deeply personal. Avoidant attachment is not simply a relationship habit. It is a survival strategy. It is a psychological architecture built over years. RS, sometimes decades of emotional conditioning. It is the nervous system learning to equate emotional distance with safety. It is vulnerability being coded as risk. It is self-protection becoming identity. And identities do not change because someone else loves us. They change because we choose to confront them. This is where many loving people become trapped. They mistake endurance for healing. They stay in emotionally inconsistent relationships, hoping their loyalty will eventually inspire emotional transformation. They excuse withdrawal. They rationalize silence. They normalize emotional unavailability because they believe their unconditional love will eventually break through, but emotional walls do not collapse because someone knocks on them long enough. They collapse when the person behind the wall decides to open the door. That distinction matters. An avoidant may absolutely meet someone extraordinary, someone deeply patient, someone emotionally safe, someone capable of healthy love. But if the avoidant has not consciously chosen to confront their fear of intimacy, even the healthiest relationship will eventually activate the same defensive patterns, because unresolved wounds do not care how wonderful the other person is. They react to emotional closeness itself. This is why people often say, I thought I was finally with the right person, but it still fell apart. The problem was never simply the partner. The problem was unhealed internal programming. Now, healing is absolutely possible. This is important. Avoidant attachment is not a life sentence. People can change. Nervous systems can be rewired. Emotional habits can be transformed. But healing requires something very specific: awareness, accountability, and deliberate emotional practice. Not intention, not promises, practice. It means learning to stay present during discomfort instead of escaping it. It means tolerating vulnerability without shutting down. It means communicating fear instead of disguising it as disinterest. It means sitting in emotional intimacy long enough for the nervous system to learn that closeness is not danger. That is difficult work. And most people avoid difficult work until pain forces them to confront it. That is why many avoidants repeat the same cycle for years. New relationship, excitement, intimacy, fear, withdrawal, distance, loss, rigor, ET, different faces, same pattern. And eventually life asks a question no one can avoid forever. Are you protecting yourself from pain or protecting yourself from love? That question changes everything. Because many avoidants believe they are preserving freedom. But often what they are preserving is fear. And fear is expensive. It costs intimacy. It costs trust. It costs peace. Sometimes it costs the person who would have loved them most deeply. And for the partner of an avoidant, this truth is equally important. Your love is valuable, but it is not medicine for someone unwilling to heal. You can support someone's growth. You can encourage honesty. You can model emotional safety, but you cannot substitute for their courage. Do not confuse your willingness to suffer for someone with your ability to save them. Healthy love is not rescuing. It is reciprocity. It is two people choosing emotional responsibility together. And if only one person is doing the emotional labor, that is not healing, that is imbalance. The brutal reality is this: avoidants do not heal because they found the one. They heal because they finally become willing to face themselves. 3 verses. And when that happens, everything changes. Because the greatest relationship breakthrough is not finding someone who can tolerate your defenses. It is becoming someone who no longer needs them. So when we step back and look at the entire picture, we begin to understand something profoundly important about avoidance and relationships. What appears to be falling out of love is often far more psychologically complex than people realize. Many avoidants do not lose love in a sudden, dramatic moment. They slowly disconnect under the weight of unresolved fear, emotional conditioning, and nervous system protection. The closer intimacy gets, the louder self-protection becomes. And because they often struggle to communicate vulnerability directly, the relationship begins deteriorating silently from the inside out. That silence creates confusion. The partner feels abandoned emotionally before they are ever abandoned physically. They start chasing clarity, reassurance, and connection, while the avoidant retreats deeper into emotional distance. And both people end up trapped inside survival patterns neither fully understands. But perhaps the most painful truth is this: avoidance A, really not always running from the other person. Many times they are running from the emotional exposure that real love demands, because real love is not just attraction. It is intimacy. It is consistency. It is emotional presence. It is the willingness to stay open when vulnerability becomes uncomfortable. And for someone conditioned to associate closeness with danger, that level of openness can feel terrifying. That is why avoidants often confuse peace with boredom, emotional safety with loss of passion, and relief after separation with certainty they made the right choice. But eventually, emotional suppression catches up. Distance may silence feelings temporarily, but it rarely resolves the deeper wound underneath. And this is where the final lesson emerges for everyone listening. Love by itself is not enough if fear remains stronger than vulnerability. No relationship can thrive when one person is constantly escaping emotional exposure while the other is constantly chasing emotional reassurance. Healthy love requires two people willing to confront themselves honestly, not perfectly honestly. Because healing does not happen when someone finds the perfect partner. Healing happens when someone becomes willing to stop running from themselves. And that applies to all of us, not just avoidance. Every human being has defenses. Every human being has fears. Every human being reaches moments where intimacy demands courage. The question is whether we allow fear to control our relationships, or whether we develop the emotional maturity to remain present when love becomes real. Because at the end of the day, the greatest tragedy is not rejection. It is allowing unresolved fear to destroy the very connection we spend our lives searching for. And the greatest transformation is not learning how to make someone love you. It is learning how to love without hiding from intimacy when it finally arrives.